Hello there and welcome to VGC. My name is Chris Scullion. Nintendo has finally added Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games to Nintendo Switch Online. If you're a Switch Online subscriber, you now have access to a selection of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, and if you also subscribe to the expansion pack, you then get a bunch of Game Boy Advance games on top of that. On day one, which was yesterday, they added 9 Game Boy and Game Boy Color games and 6 Game Boy Advance games for a total of 15. Now you might not be familiar with all these games. Maybe you're a young buck who wasn't around at the time. Some of these games are nearly 35 years old, or maybe just some of them are a wee bit obscure and they passed you by at the first time. So I am here to fill you in, as they say, on some of the missing details so that you know exactly what's waiting for you when you finally boot up your Game Boy and Game Boy Advance libraries. So let's get cracking. Let's start with Game Boy and Game Boy Color first, and we'll take them in alphabetical order because that's a great way to do these things. First up is Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, and this is probably the one that most people will be least familiar with, certainly the Game Boy Color version at least, but it actually is probably the one that may impress you the most when you first try it, because this actually pushes the Game Boy Color to its limits. Some would argue it's a port of the game that was released on the likes of the Dreamcast, and that was a survival horror game, a bit of a Resident Evil ripoff. I say that the original Alone in the Dark came first, but this New Nightmare kind of reboot was clearly kind of more inspired by the Resi games. And rather than just go 2D, and because a lot of Game Boy Color ports were nothing like the console versions they were based on, they actually attempted to recreate a kind of 3D style survival horror on Game Boy Color, and it looks surprisingly good. It actually holds up fairly well. There's a lot of kind of transitions between rooms and screens which can get a wee bit annoying, but other than that it looks pretty good, and especially if you play it on handheld mode in the Switch with the screen small enough, it's not too bad for a Game Boy Color game. It's not the greatest game ever, but you'll probably play it as a novelty and just go, hey, look at that, Game Boy Color actually could do this is quite cool. Up next is Game & Watch Gallery 3. I love the Game & Watch Gallery games, and this is a good one. There's 5 Game & Watch games here. There's Egg, Greenhouse, Turtle Bridge, Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong Jr. And what this compilation does is it lets you play modern and classic versions. So the classic version plays just like the original Game & Watch version, with the kind of little rubbish looking characters and wee blips and bloops. But then the modern versions replace them with modern Mario characters and gives them proper music and proper sound effects. The great thing about this game is that there's lots of unlockables. There's actually another 5 games on top of the 5 that are available that can be unlocked. Although those only have classic versions, there's no modern versions for those. And there's a bunch of other stuff. There's like a main museum mode where you can see animations of some other Game & Watch games and stuff like that. So it's good fun. And also the fact that the Switch Online lets you create restore points and has a rewind feature means that if you mess up a really long run, because sometimes you need to get pretty high scores to unlock some of these extras, you can just rewind back and cheat a bit, and I won't tell anyone, don't worry. Then there's Gargoyles Quest. This is another kind of slightly hidden gem on the Game Boy. This is a spin-off of Ghosts and Goblins, where you play as Firebrand, who's one of the kind of gargoyle enemies from Ghosts and Goblins, and then becomes the hero in this one. It's part of it is kind of top down, like almost like an RPG style, where you explore towns in like an overworld, but then it switches to side scrolling, like an action platformer where you can float around and attack enemies and stuff. It was good enough at the time that it led to it got a prequel on the NES, which came later. And then it got a sequel on the SNES called Demon's Crest, which is actually also on Switch Online and is also brilliant. So if you give Gargoyles Quest, easy for me to say, a spin, and you really like it, then check out Demon's Crest on Switch Online, because you'll like that as well. Next up is Kirbys Dreamland. Now this is the very first, the original Kirby game, and it's pretty basic and it's quite easy. But that was the intention. It was supposed to be an easy platformer that was kind of designed to ease kind of new players into the world of platform video games. It's also doesn't include the ability to swallow enemies and steal their powers. You can still swallow enemies, but all you can do with them is spit them out, and he can still fly. He can swallow air and float, but he can steal their powers. That didn't come until Kirby's Adventure on the NES a year later. So it's quite basic, but it's still really enjoyable, and it's quite charming. If you are the hardcore type who swears blind that they'll never play a game this easy, if you press select up and A on the title screen, you'll unlock extra mode, which is basically the hard mode, and that may be more to your tastes, but for most people just play it normally. It's just a bit of fun. This is followed by Link's Awakening DX. That's not a reference to popular WWF stable D-Generation X. It's all the kind of Game Boy Color DX games were basically deluxe colour versions of games that were already released on the Game Boy. So rather than give us the kind of monochrome black and white version of Link's Awakening that was on the original Game Boy, they've given us DX, the colour version on the Game Boy Color. This is an interesting one because the remake obviously was released on the Switch, so it's quite interesting that Nintendo's given us the original, probably for comparison purposes. If you're not familiar with it, Link washes up on this island called Koholint Island, and he can't leave until he finds his 8 musical instruments that will wake up the Windfish, which is on a big mountain. The DX version adds an extra dungeon, which is probably the reason why Nintendo's added it. There's no point adding the original Game Boy one and then adding the DX one further down the line and making people play the whole thing again just for an extra dungeon. So they've probably just gone right away. Here's your extra dungeon. Go wild. It's one of the weirder Zelda games out there. I really like it, but it's odd because it's just when it comes to like cameos, you end up like fighting Goombas and piranha plants at times, and there's weird cameos from Kart, like Wart from Super Mario Brothers 2 is in there. Mr. Wright, who's based on Will Wright from SimCity, he's in there. So it's a weird one, but a really enjoyable one. Whether or not you've got the Switch remake, it's worth playing this because it's a really cool adventure. In a similar tone, Metroid 2 Return of Samus is another interesting one because it was remade on the 3DS as Samus Returns, which did so well it led to Mercury Steam making Metroid Dread on the Switch. This is another really good game which hasn't kind of been re-released that often, but it might be a wee bit tricky for modern players because back in the day there was no in-game map, so it's a Metroidvania, hence Metroid. But whereas the 3DS version added a map to the second screen, there's no map here, so you either need to memorise it or draw your own map or something like that. So it's one of the few games of the 15 on offer on day one on Switch Online that may hold up the least well because just modern gaming sensibilities mean most people who play Metroidvanias expect to have a map, and this one doesn't have one. So as long as you can put up with that, or even if you turn to the old international network, the old internet, and find a guide on there, then a map on there, that might help. But in terms of having an in-game map that you can track your progress on, it's not here. There's also Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins. Interestingly, Nintendo's just ditched the first Super Mario Land. Hopefully it'll come later because it's got better music, and gone straight for the sequel instead. In a way it's understandable because although Super Mario Land 2 only came out 3 years after the first one, the gulf in quality in those 3 years is crazy. It looks like a proper handheld version of a console Mario game. It was also the debut of Wario. Wario appears as the final boss in this one. But other than that, it plays a lot like maybe like a kind of Super Mario Bros. 3 style feel to it. It does have a weird kind of magic carrot item, a power up which turns Mario into Bunny Mario, which basically just means he floats quite slowly. So it is one of the weaker power ups in Mario history because it's not much different from the raccoon, the leaf that turns him into a raccoon, except he can't swing his tail, so it's kind of weaker, and he can't fly. But hey, it is what it is. You take what you can get in the world of Super Mario Land 2. Up next is Tetris, and you can't have a Game Boy collection without having the launch game that kind of cemented its status on day one. What can you say about Tetris? Tetris is Tetris, and the Game Boy one is I believe still one of the greatest versions of all time. If you're more used to modern Tetris games, the likes of Tetris Effect and even like the DS, the Tetris DS and stuff that came out after that, this one may be really difficult to you because it doesn't have what's known as infinite spin, which means when a block lands on the floor in modern Tetris games, when a block hits the ground, you can keep hitting the rotate button to keep it in place and shuffle it side to side, whereas in this original Game Boy version, as soon as it hits the ground, bang, it's locked in place. So if you're more used to modern Tetris, this might be a lot more difficult, but it also makes it a lot more rewarding. When you clear, Game B's got a mode, it's got a Game A and Game B mode. Game B is when you try and clear 25 lines without getting game over, and if you can manage that on the hardest difficulty, you get cool wee animation and stuff, and it's really satisfying because it's quite difficult. But Tetris is an absolute stone cold classic, and I'm really glad it's there on day one. And the last Game Boy game, or should I say Game Boy Color game, on day one is Wario Land 3. Again, it's interesting that they've went straight to Wario Land 3. They ditched Wario Land, which was Super Mario Land 3, and then ditched Wario Land 2, and have gone straight to Wario Land 3. Hopefully the others turn up at some point further down the line just to have the complete collection. In this one, Wario crashes his plane near a cave, so he decides to go and explore it, and he finds this music box, and then he gets shrunk down and kind of transported inside it, and this kind of mysterious guy, who definitely isn't the bad guy, honestly, says to him, if you can find 5 small music boxes that have got my powers in them, and bring them back to me, I'll send you back to the real world, and any treasure you find along the way, you can keep it. It's kind of like Wario Land 2 in that you can't be killed. Wario can't actually die in it, and a lot of the power-ups you get are actually, you get them from being deliberately hit by enemies. So if you get hit by like an ice enemy, he might turn into a snowman, which lets him slide down hills and break blocks that are at the bottom. It's a quirky one, it's an interesting one. It won't be everyone's taste because it's not like a proper conventional 2D platformer. There's kind of puzzle elements to it, and it's not as obviously linear kind of A to B platforming, but if it clicks with you, you'll really enjoy it. That's the Game Boy games, but now we'll look at the Game Boy Advance ones. Again, these only are available if you're subscribed to the Switch Online expansion pack, which costs a bit extra. So basically, if you've got access to the Mega Drive / Genesis and N64 libraries, then you'll get access to the Game Boy Advance as well, because it's the same tier. The first GBA game available is Kurukuru, which I am delighted to see on here because I really wasn't expecting that at all. This is a kind of cult favourite for a lot of Nintendo fans, and I'm really happy to see it as one of the first games because you will be obsessed with this game if you haven't played it before. You control the Helirin, which is a kind of a weird ship, like almost like a helicopter rotor, which is continually rotating slowly, but rotating nevertheless. And you just have to get through a series of stages with it. But the fact that it's constantly rotating means that you have to take your time and you have to move at the right point, otherwise it bumps off a wall, and if you hit a wall too many times, the thing just explodes and it's game over. Getting through the stages is tricky enough in itself, really satisfying when you pull it off, but there are then things like gold stars for beating a level without taking a hit, and there's like record times it gives you to beat, so there's a lot of replay value, so you'll probably become obsessed with this one like I was back in the day. It's a great entry, great addition on day one. Also on there is The Legend of Zelda Diminished Cap, which is an interesting Zelda game because it was mainly developed by Capcom and its subsidiary studio Flagship, and kind of supervised by Nintendo rather than being a full-on Nintendo game. The main gimmick is that Link has a talking hat called Eslo, which lets him shrink down to a tiny size. It's like a weird hat with a beak on it, and every now and then you can use it to shrink down, and there's all sorts of japes and puzzles involving going small, Honey I Shrunk the Kids style, which is all lovely. I really enjoy it. Again, if it's another Zelda game to add to the collection, and if it's one that you've never played before, you can tick that off as yet another Zelda game that's available on the Switch. It's rarely re-released. I think the only other time it's been properly re-released is on the Wii U Virtual Console, so this is a good chance to own it in quotation marks as part of your kind of Switch library. Another good game is Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. This is another one that was remade. It was remade on the 3DS, but if you don't have access to that, then you're in for a treat with this one. The Mario and Luigi series has got a reputation for being really funny and having really funny writing, and this was the one that kind of started that off. The writing is genuinely hilarious at times, and some of the new characters like Fawful are really entertaining and became like kind of Mario favourites. The developer Alpha Dream, kind of Japanese studio, just nailed it so much that Nintendo let them make like another 4 Mario and Luigi games and 2 remakes. Sadly, they went bankrupt in 2019, so we might not get another Mario and Luigi game. So if you're new to this one, make the most of it, because there may not be any more beyond the ones we ended up getting. The cool thing about this one is that Nintendo released a thing called the Game Boy Player for the GameCube, and kind of bolted onto the bottom of the GameCube, and you could put cartridges in, Game Boy cartridges, and you could get Rumble on a handful of games on your GameCube controller, and that Rumble support has been carried over here, so it's almost like you're playing the Game Boy Player version. So if your Switch controller supports Rumble, you can turn it on and get Rumble in the game, which is a nice wee touch. Up next is Mario Kart Super Circuit, which is a kind of interesting halfway house between Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64, which both had come out before it, because it plays most like the SNES one. It's got a kind of pseudo Mode 7 style 3D appearance where you're kind of driving along a flat plane, but it adds N64 things like the blue shell and stuff like that, and the character designs are based on the N64 one, so they're more rather than just being sprites, they look more like a Donkey Kong Country style, like pre-rendered 3D. So it's an interesting kind of middle ground between the two. It's got one of the best unlockables in Nintendo's history to that point, where if you win all 5 cups and collect the 100 coins in the cups, you'll unlock the extra cups, which are basically all the SNES tracks, which basically doubles the track count. The game has 20 tracks, but then when you unlock the SNES ones, it goes up to 40. And for the longest time, that made it the Mario Kart game with more tracks than any other, until actually right up until Mario Kart 8 got DLC. Up until that point, Super Circuit was the one with the most courses, which is crazy. I'm not that good at it, as you can see in the footage. It's one of those ones where if you play a lot of Mario Kart these days, it'll take you a while to get used to this, because the handling is very different. It's kind of, again, it's stuck in between the SNES and the N64 game in terms of how it feels, so it'll take a bit of adjustment to get back into this style of racing, but it's still a fun game nevertheless. Then there's Super Mario Advance 4, which is a Game Boy Advance port of Super Mario Bros. 3. Specifically, it's a port of the Super Mario All-Stars version on the SNES, which was kind of visually improved over the NES one. But this kind of goes one step further. It adds stuff like voice acting. Charles Martinet pops up and gives it a bit of banter. The best thing about this one, this specific Switch Online version, is that it includes all the EReader stages. Now, for those who don't know, the EReader was a kind of add-on that came out for the Game Boy Advance, and it let you scan kind of cards, almost like a barcode reader, and it had collectible cards that you could scan for different games. Basically, it added DLC to the games long before you could download the content. And this game had a bunch of cards released in North America and a load of cards released in Japan, but the e-reader never came out in Europe, so we never got it. To this day, I mean, nowadays you can't get them for love nor money, and you can't really scan the cards, so it's fantastic that Nintendo, this was the case in the Wii U version as well, but the Wii U Virtual Console, but they've done it here as well. All 38 e-reader card stages are available and included in this version as well, so even if you've played Super Mario Bros. 3 to death, and even if you lived in Europe or even in North America and you played Super Mario Advance 4, this particular version, you might not have played the e-reader stages, and these stages are really cool because they add power-ups and enemies that weren't in Mario 3. So for example, one stage lets you pull up vegetables like in Mario 2 and then throw them at charging chucks from like Super Mario World, and other stages like the cape from Mario World in it. It's really cool. It's good for preservation just to have these, because nobody can go and buy these 38 e-reader cards without spending an absolute fortune on them. and now you've just got instant access to all those kind of secret stages that were locked away for a lot of people, especially in Europe. And then finally there's WarioWare Inc. Mega Micro Game dollar symbol, or basically just WarioWare. This was the one that kicked off the micro games craze. The original WarioWare, there's over 200 micro games in it, and if you're not familiar with how it plays, it's basically it throws them at you in rapid succession, and you've only got a few seconds to figure out what the game is and how to clear the task. And then if you don't manage it, you lose a life. If you do manage it, you keep going. They're split into categories like sports and sci-fi, but the best ones, I think a lot of people agree, is the retro ones, because they basically recreate old Nintendo games, which is really good fun. It's also got loads of unlockables, including some mini games that have become like Nintendo favourites in their own right, and ended up being released separately on like the DSiWare eShop. Stuff like Paper Plane and Pyoro, which on DSi was renamed Bird and Beans. It's got a hell of a lot of unlockable content, and this, again, if you didn't play WarioWare the first time around, especially the original one, this might be one of the games that will take up the most of your time on the Switch. But that's it so far. That's all 15 games available right now on Nintendo Switch. Again, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color ones are available on Switch Online, and the Game Boy Advance ones are available on the Switch Online expansion pack. And yeah, they're all those ones I just spoke about are there right now. If you enjoyed this, please do let us know in the comments. If you'd like us to do this every time Nintendo announces new games for the Game Boy or Game Boy Advance Switch Online libraries, and even for the NES, SNES, N64 and Mega Drive ones, let us know, and we will endeavour to do that. Otherwise, please do like and subscribe and do all the usual YouTube stuff. You know the drill, you know how these things work, and keep it on VGC for all your gaming goodness. Thanks guys, bye bye.